Welcome to Your Grey Matters, the podcast that unveils the miracles already amongst us. Here, we believe that the human mind cannot be defeated. Tune in to discover the fascinating people with extraordinary stories, innovative products, and groundbreaking services. With your host, Neil Silvert, who's earned his gray hair and still has use of his gray matter.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the Your Grey Matters podcast, and we are excited to have you back. You know, it's hard to believe that Remembrance Day is coming up again. It seems like just yesterday that I had our guest, Tony Bratschitsch, who is, you can see on our screen. He was on a year ago. He was fabulous. He's known as probably one of the greatest authorities and most knowledgeable men on Remembrance Day. I asked Tony to come back because last year we gave a great history of Remembrance Day. But this year we want to go back. We want to talk about the relevance of it. And Tony, welcome to the Your Grey Matters podcast. Thanks for coming on.
Well, thank you very much, Neil. And thank you for what you're doing.
Well, it's my honor. In fact, Tony, I was given a big honor this year. I'm going to be at one of our local legions on Remembrance Day placing one of the wreaths. And I'm very, very honored to do that.
Very nice.
Yeah, I was quite honored when I was asked. So, ladies and gentlemen, let me tell you a bit about Tony. Or you can go back to our first one with Tony, episode 25, Remembering Remembrance Day. But I like to brag about Tony, actually. He's an award-winning speaker. He's a lawyer. He's a business consultant. He's busy, folks, and he's teaching and public speaking all the time. But what he does well is he uses the opportunities that he has to speak to promote Remembrance Day. And, you know, he's involved with the Legions. He's involved with the cadet program and a lot of young kids. He even teaches kids who have homeschooling. He's fantastic. So, Tony, welcome to the Your Grey Matters podcast again. Let's talk about the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, known as Remembrance Day. And Tony, maybe we could start off. Let's just do a quick history about Remembrance Day. For those who aren't quite sure where it comes from, perhaps give us a brief history.
It's a historical fact. On November the 11th, at the 11th hour, in the year 1918, the armistice was signed in Europe. It brought to a conclusion 4 horrible years of tragedy, of young people killing young people, starvation, lives destroyed, disease spreading around. That it was a monumentous occasion when that happened. And it was thought of the war to end all wars because it was so bad. And, you know, as far as Canada's concerned, the First World War, was a much greater consequences than the Second World War, which of course was bad in itself. And we also think of the fallen in the Korean peace action, which is known as the Korean War, and Afghanistan, and other police activities where we were involved in, like in Bosnia. West, November the 11th, 1918 has set a day of infamy for Canadians, but yet it was a monumental occasion for Canada as a country.
How so, Tony?
Relevance. Canada seemed to become relevant to the world at that point. Now,
Really?
in that era, we were still a colony. We were part of the Commonwealth.
That's true.
We were part of the Commonwealth.
Yeah.
So when Great Britain went to war in 1914, automatically we went to war. We had a population of approximately 6.5 million people, which does not include Newfoundland, because Newfoundland became a province in 1949. So the rest of Canada had that population. And we answered the call. When Great Britain wanted support from its Commonwealth, Canada answered. And over the course of the 4 years, we sent approximately 630,000 people into Europe to do the duty that we were called upon to do. We simply just did not place 630,000 people overseas. They pitched in. And of that 630,000 people, over 66,000 were killed. That's slightly over 10% of fatalities. Yes. I'm glad I'm not an expert in this type of thing, but I have read from historians that if there's a 6% casualty ratio, that's very high. But we had a 10% fatality ratio. We also had 138,000 plus men and women seriously wounded. When you take the fatalities and those serious injuries, you put them together, that's the formula for casualties. So our casualty ratio was 32% versus each percent. And of all the participants in the First World War, that was the second highest casualty ratio. Only Russia had a higher casualty ratio, and Russia, of course, had a border, that was confronting the battle scenes. Russia was a participant, a primary participant. It was one of the creators of the war. We weren't. Our casualty ratio, and again, this is a percentage of population. It was higher than France, Belgium, Great Britain, Italy, Turkey, all those countries that were directly involved. And so, there could be a question. What? And, some people would say, well, they could say falsely, okay, that Great Britain, threw us under the bus. No, absolutely not. No. It was due to Canadian effectiveness. For some reason, Canada became the most innovative participant in the war. In that war, the war saw a lot of innovation, of course. Machine guns, barbed wire, mustard gas, flying airplanes that had bombs and, weapons on them. It was a lot of innovation. Yep. But the Canadian participation in the strategy was somewhat unique. And until about 1917, the war was back and forth over a couple miles, Flanders fields and, Somme and other places, until Canada made the first breakthrough with Vimy Ridge. And Neil, as you know, we had a tremendous memorial at Vimy Ridge.
Were you sure doing?
When the Canadians took Vimy Ridge, was after the French and the British tried on one hand and the Germans on the other hand, and they lost together hundreds of thousands of young boys. Young boys that came from farms and schools and families, who were told to put on a uniform and do their duty, right? But Canada got involved in Vimy Ridge. We did things differently, and we took Vimy Ridge. Neil, are you a fan of Star Wars? Have you seen any of the Star Wars movies?
Oh, yeah, lately quite often I just have to go onto my TV and I can watch them.
You know that phrase, Stormtroopers? That's us. That's Canadians. Because the Germans gave our soldiers that nickname, Stormtroopers. And it's not
It's not, right?
It's not because, we necessarily had our soldiers marching through the rain and thunder. I mean, they did, of course, under the most horrendous conditions. And I'm getting a little into the weeds here, but this is just an example, and I'll stop with one example. But the Canadians developed a rolling barrage of artillery that would feed shells into the battlefield, where the enemy would duck and keep their heads down in the trenches. And our Canadian troops would march right behind that rolling barrage. It was so precise that there was no friendly fire. And as soon as the barrage stopped, and before the Germans could even look up, there were the Canadians right on top of it, right through that storm. That was just one of many examples. It got to the point throughout that war for the next period of time after Vimy Ridge that we were so effective, the Allied forces were going to promote our Chief General, Arthur Currie, to be the Grand Marshal of the entire Allied forces.
My God. So Tony, we obviously have a wonderful and heroic history in the war, and I dare say the wars. I often say to people when we're talking about Canada, Canadians don't generally like to fight, but we've proven in many wars and Korea that it's a bad idea to get our army involved because we will win. And I thank you for that. And Tony, when I was at the Senate half a year ago, and again, I'm going to the Legion this year, I was actually so happily taken with how many young faces I saw in the crowd last year. You and I were at the same cenotaph. It was a big turnout. But let's talk about relevance for today's generations, Tony, because you're a gentleman who's introducing people to not only Remembrance Day, but I think to the greatness and the goodness of our military and our leadership. And how do you think, though, that younger people, because when I was planning this podcast, I realized, funny, my late father was born in 1930, so he was too young to fight in the Second World War. I was born in 54. I was too young to fight in a war. It could have been Vietnam, but that was more of an American gig. But really, it's been a long time of generations, thank God, who haven't touched the taste of war. And so the relevance of Remembrance Day is, does it help younger generations feel more connected to historical conflicts, to our history? I'm wondering if you could answer that.
Last night, I had the honor of presenting a talk to the Royal Canadian Sea Cadets in Dundas, RCSCC Dundas. And I was talking in the same terms, asking them what they thought the relevance was. Now, of course, they were trying to come to grips with it. I've had the advantage of 15 years of reading many submissions for students. My answer is this. The relevance of Remembrance Day is there is a better way. There is a better way. War is inevitable in many situations, right, Villéo? It's part of the DNA of human beings who have been on this planet for 1 million years. In our present form, our species has been walking around the same way we are now for about 100,000 years, right? It's just one of the ugly traits of our human nature. But we've evolved. And once I understood what the students were telling as an aggregate, as a group, that there is a better way, I started to understand what in Flanders fields meant. Okay? And we're all familiar with that sonnet. It's a poem, but it's a sonnet. We're all familiar with it. And as I was growing up, I never thought twice about what it really meant after all, it sort of spoke for itself. We are the dead. We were loved and we did love. Now we're buried. That near the end, it tells us to hold the torch high. I never thought to question. It did not say, take the rifle, pull the trigger, and kill the next guy, It didn't say that. It didn't say, live with hate or continue, the fight. It did say, pick up the quarrel. But it mentioned, keep the torch hot. Well, for many years, I've been asking students, what is the torch? What does the torch represent? And in the 15 years I've probably done close to 100 presentations in schools. And quite often, they're interactive. When I go to a school, present some awards from the poster and literary contest, or sometimes to give a talk upon their request, I don't know if I'm going to be approaching a group of 10 students, 12 students in the classroom, or it could be an auditorium full of half the school. One time I walked into a school on Hamilton Mountain, not knowing what my audience was consist of, and I ended up presenting to a gymnasium with 600 people in it.
Wow.
A kindergarten, up to grandparents. They were there for another reason, but they included me right into that presentation. And, and I had to be relevant to all of them. So the question is, what does the torch mean? What are we holding up hot? So the message that I'm now conveying from the students is that we're holding up the torch, that there is a better way. And I'm going to give you 2 examples of that actually happening in action.
Okay.
A long time ago, it was a Suez crisis. Britain and France were threatening to take over the Suez Canal, and the people in their way were Canadian soldiers. And that's one of the reasons why the Prime Minister of Canada received the Nobel Peace Prize. We did our duty. We did our duty without prejudice, without bias. And of course, for we are French and English. But we were there. Now, the second reason, something that I witnessed for myself, and I kind of recognized immediately when it happened, was with the event of the Second Gulf War. Now, we know there was a purpose to the First Gulf War. One country invaded another, and the world got together and, invaded that first country. But there were questions about the legitimacy of the cause of the Second Gulf War. And when the United States decided to start that Second Gulf War, a lot of its friends and allies fell in line and marched to that drumbeat. Canada did not. Our Prime Minister stood up many times and said, we do not believe in the cause of this war. We will not send our young men and women to die for that improper cause. There was a better way. Logic, love, humanity, a sense of what we're all about. We're about doing the right thing. We will not send young men and women into war. And last year when you and I spoke, we talked about the relevance to the families. Of course, I don't think, if you wish, we can go back and revisit that topic. But as you and I were at the cenotaph last year, as we have been for many years, we recognize that cenotaph was not built by any government. It was built by the families and the communities. over 3,000 cenotaphs across Canada. Now, our cenotaph in Dundas and elsewhere, they are maintained by the municipalities. That is the only government input.
So that they're really maintained by the community of people as opposed to the government to keep them sturdy and clean and healthy for us, if I can use that. Tony, this is so fascinating. I want to ask you something, though. Let's stick with relevance. But as young people are studying Remembrance Day, I think that we're all studying Remembrance Day. And I think about today's vets. Now, we have vets from the Second World War still with us, although I imagine that they're quite elderly. But we have vets from many ages. Some are young. And I wonder, does Remembrance Day every year play a role in helping support these veterans?
I'll give you a personal example. The Royal Canadian Legion, as you know, we distribute poppies. We don't like to use the word sell. If someone wanted a poppy for free, we can have a poppy for free, because remembrance is more important. The funds that are generated stay in the poppy fund, which is severely audited by the federal government, which is good, right? They want to make sure that the money contributed by people in our communities go to the designated places, which are controlled. Well, a couple of months ago, myself and the president of our Legion, Janice Mancini, we visited 5 nursing homes. We went to see veterans, and quite often they're widows or widowers. And the final place we went to was Shalom Village in New Westia, not far from there. And, it's not just for one religion. It's, it's for all religions. We had, from the Legion, donated a lot of money from the Poppy Fund towards something called a bubble room. The chief executive officer was so thrilled we came by. She took us to the bubble room. And there were bubbles. There were tubes of colored fluid with bubbles moving up and down, very soothingly. And there was soft music. There's a science to this. Soft music. And the workers were standing there beside us beaming with a sense of accomplishment. And the thought I had in my mind was, they would be pleased. Whoever they were, right? The soldiers, the families, whoever, they would be pleased.
What an amazing story, Tony. So what you're telling me is the community still cares. There is value in you teaching younger people. You told us how they've reacted. I witness people of all ages wearing a poppy right now. And I find it amazing that there aren't many things, I think, that pull the generations together. But somehow Remembrance Day does, and a pride in our military and our history and our country seems to come through on November 11th at 11 a.m. But it tells me it's not just that time period. Clearly there's a pride all the time. And Tony, as we wrap up, I want to say something to you. We are lucky to have you doing this. I don't know if you even realize how important what you're doing is doing, because it will outlive you, I'm sure. And that's a great honor. I'm hoping that you'll be here a long time since we're about the same age. Ladies and gentlemen, please, this year, Monday, go and celebrate Remembrance Day. It's worth your time not only to do the honorable duty of being there, but also you will find a fellowship and a joy in being surrounded by lots and lots of people who are having common thoughts with you. and I encourage you all to go. Tony, thank you so much for doing this again. The truth is, I could have you on every day for about a year, and it would continue to be interesting. Ladies and gentlemen, we will be back next week on Monday. Thanks for tuning in. Thanks for watching. If you found it interesting and you liked it, give us a thumbs up. If you're ready to subscribe, click right here. And if you'd like to see another episode, click right here. Tell a friend. Send us comments. Thanks a lot.